The contemporary civil rights movement unfolded directly in response to the murder of Trayvon Martin.
Well, that's a load of bullshit. One, it wasn't a new civil rights movement. Racial victimism is not civil rights. Two, self-defense is not murder.
Sanford police still trying to figure out exactly what happened in this spot here last night. We talked to a man who didn't want to be shown on camera, who witnessed part of the attack right here, then went upstairs to his window and witnessed the rest of it after he called 911. Hey, what are you thinking now about all this?
This afternoon, I talked to John through his front door about what he saw last night during a fight that turned into a deadly shooting.
The guy on the bottom, who I believe had a red sweater on, was yelling to me, "Help, help." I told him to stop, and I was calling 911.
John locked his patio door, ran upstairs, and heard at least one gunshot.
And then when I got upstairs and looked down, the person that was on top beating up the other guy was the one laying in the grass, and I believe he was dead at that point.
Sanford Police Department, lines being recorded, Sean.
Hey, we've had some break-ins in my neighborhood, and there's a real suspicious guy. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. He looks black.
Whoa, nice creative editing. Just as bad as NBC, I see.
Sanford Police Department, lines being recorded, Sean.
Hey, we've had some break-ins in my neighborhood, and there's a real suspicious guy. This guy looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something.
Okay, and this guy, is he white, black, or Hispanic?
He looks black.
Did you see what he was wearing?
A dark hoodie, like a gray hoodie, and either jeans or sweatpants and white tennis shoes. He's here now. He was just staring.
Oh, he's just walking around the area?
At all the houses. Yeah, now he's coming towards me.
Okay.
He's got his hand in his waistband. Yeah, he's a black male. He's got something in his hands. I don't know what his deal is. Yep. He's coming to check me out.
Just let me know if this guy does anything else.
Okay. These assholes, they always get away.
And they always did get away. In June of 2011, a rash of robberies hit the retreat, and George had direct experience with many of them. George had his first experience with the burglaries at the retreat when his wife Shelley's bicycle was stolen from his front porch. Then on August 3rd, a home invasion occurred at the retreat where a mother and her child had to hide in their closet as two African-American males broke into their house. When they were fleeing, they ran past Shelley Zimmerman, George's wife. Later that night, Shelley would recognize one of them again and told George to call the police. He got away. 3 days later, Shelley again recognized both perps this time and told George to call the police. Again, they got away. 3 more burglaries on record with no one caught. That is when the retreat started the neighborhood watch, and the members were told to report anything even slightly suspicious. On February 2nd, 2012, George would see an African-American male looking into the window of Frank Taffy's house and would call the police. He would get away. A week later, another burglary occurred, but this time some construction workers nearby saw the perpetrator flee and enter one of the other houses in the complex and directed the cops to that house. That perpetrator was arrested. His name was Emmanuel Burgess, and his fingerprints would be confirmed in the home invasion that Shelley witnessed, as well as the attempted burglary at Frank Taffy's house. But his accomplices were still at large. Then a few weeks later, as George is driving to the store, he sees an individual who is not Frank Taffy near the entrance of Taffy's house looking about. That would be Trayvon Martin.
He's running.
He's running? Which way is he running?
Down towards the other entrance of the neighborhood.
Okay. Which entrance is that he's heading towards?
The back entrance.
Are you following him?
Yeah.
Okay, we don't need you to do that.
Okay.
All right, sir. What is your name?
It's George. He ran.
And that is the problem. Trayvon did run away. We know where George parked and where the physical encounter first occurred. They are 128 feet apart. An average jogger would have covered that distance in less than 20 seconds. From the moment George says that Trayvon is running and exits his car to the moment he stops, no more wind noise is heard and he says that he ran. 32 seconds have passed. In other words, he has easily reached the crosswalk intersection, the point of encounter proven to be where Zimmerman dropped his keys in the altercation, and Trayvon is no longer there, nor visible from there. This moment is confirmed by Rachel Gentel's testimony, where she says Trayvon ran and lost George. The physical encounter would occur over 3.5 minutes later at the same place George was standing at that moment, and that Trayvon had run by and was no longer visible from. And if we go by Jane Serdica's testimony of seeing Trayvon's body from her window, visibility was at least at 90 feet, and there were no bushes to hide. So we know that Trayvon ran at least 90 feet down that dog walk from the intersection. There's no way the encounter occurred at the intersection unless Trayvon, who had left, who ran, chose to return and confront George.
Well, my first response to the news of Trayvon Martin's death was, as a parent, the thing we fear most.
The shooting death of a black youth in Florida sent out new shockwaves today.
Then, when you found out the circumstances, I responded specifically as a black parent.
So you responded as a black parent when you are the president of the United States and are supposed to represent all parents. When you were president, What were you doing to represent Christopher Servini's parents?
Not guilty, the verdict in the manslaughter trial of Roderick Scott. After more than 19 hours of deliberations over 2 days, a jury acquitted Scott in the manslaughter trial for the shooting death of Christopher Servini last April.
Scott breathed a huge sigh of relief as he left the courtroom.
I just want to say thank you for people who believed in me, who stood by me. I still have my regrets for the Servini family. I mean, it's still an unfortunate situation for them. I am happy that at least this chapter of it's over.
Servini's family members say justice wasn't served. They say Christopher was murdered in cold blood and that he had never been in trouble, and Scott acted as judge, jury, and executioner.
And the message is that we can all go out and get guns and shoot anybody that we feel that is threatening us, and lie about the fact my son never threatened anybody. He was a gentle child. His nature was gentle. He was a good person, and he was never, ever arrested for anything and has never been in trouble. He was 16 years and 4 months old.
Scott says he acted in self-defense when he confronted Servini. Scott says he shot Servini twice when the victim charged toward him, yelling that he was going to get Scott.
How could this happen to a beautiful, sweet child like that? All he wanted to do was go home. And then for them to say that he was saying, please don't kill me, I'm just a kid. And he just kept on shooting him.
Where was your outrage when Adrian Carey, an African-American, killed Marco Santiago, a 17-year-old Hispanic boy, in Florida? Or is your outrage only when you have your buddy from the protest in 2005 for Martin Lee Anderson, Benjamin Crump, call you and tell you that you should be outraged about something?
You know, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon.
And George Zimmerman could have looked like your son if you had gotten married with your first fiancée.
I don't know what this child could have done to be safe, except not be black.
How about not assaulting someone?
This is the picture captured from the video at the 7-Eleven before this incident took place. It's relevant because it shows Trayvon standing there in the same clothing he was wearing the night. But I think most importantly is the individual on the left is the store clerk. With testimony, we showed that the floor was level for both of these individuals. They were standing at the same level. The guy on the left testified that he's 5'10". We hired an engineer to do some vectoring at the 7-Eleven, some analysis. With shoes, hair, and hoodie, measured Trayvon at over 6'2" the night of the incident. George isn't. He's what, 5'8", maybe 5'7". So there was a dramatic height difference in the two individuals.
The guy on the bottom, who I believe had a red sweater on, was yelling to me, help, help. I told him to stop, and I was calling 911.
John locked his patio door, ran upstairs, and heard at least one gunshot.
And then when I got upstairs and looked down, the person that was on top beating up the other guy was the one laying in the grass, and I believe he was dead at that point.
The idea that this teenager who was walking down the street could be considered so threatening that a private citizen could initiate a confrontation, resulting in that teenager's death.
There's absolutely no evidence that Zimmerman initiated the confrontation with Martin. In fact, the evidence shows that he left and came back and then confronted Zimmerman.
Who hit who first in your mind?
In my mind, I believe Trayvon.
He simply went to the store and was headed back home. And for somebody to look at him and perceive him to be a burglar, that is the problem.
Why would it be a problem? If they saw him in an area that he wasn't supposed to be, what was he doing? Right near the entrance of a house that wasn't his. That's what the neighborhood watch is. You report things that are out of place, and he was out of place.
So when I saw him in the same area in front of the guy's house that I know is unsecured, and he was looking into the house, I just thought something doesn't fit right here. That's why I felt suspicious.
Okay. When I saw his photographs, I thought, wow, he looks like Barack.
Trayvon Martin looked like I did at the age of 15, 16, 17.
You are mixed. You are half African and half white. You're as white as Zimmerman was. He's half white, and then his mother is half Native American and half African. You look more like Zimmerman's uncle, his mother's brother, than you do Trayvon Martin. You promised to be the president of all people, but we at least expected you to be the president of mixed people. And you threw somebody who was as mixed as you under the bus.
There were many times I'd get on the elevator and women would clutch their purse, or I'd walk by a car and suddenly you'd hear the locks go down. And then maybe the only thing that separated us was luck.
It had nothing to do with luck. It had to do with life circumstances. Unfortunately, Trayvon's father and his stepmother divorced. He changed schools. The life that he knew was massively changed, and he started hanging out with the wrong crowd in his last year. And he started fighting, and he started doing drugs. Tried purchasing an illegal gun. When you start thinking about making people bleed and how you can mount somebody and how you can beat somebody to a pulp. Well, that's the type of life you're going to live. And sometimes you're going to meet somebody that can beat you up instead. Or even worse, you're going to meet somebody who's going to defend himself with a weapon, and you might be dead. And that's what happened to Trayvon Martin.
What it did was to surface what a lot of African Americans and other people of color in some cases have felt for a long time. And that, I think, was a galvanizing force in helping to create a broader based movement that we now know as Black Lives Matter.
A fight where people are seeing that when Black Lives Matter, all lives will actually matter.
The problem is that that is not what happens. Look, Black Lives Matter seeks to highlight the killing of Black Americans, typically men by alleged vigilantes, by law enforcement and even quasi-law enforcement. You know, Black Lives Matter points out that Black Americans die at the hand of police at 2.5 times the rate of white Americans. While it is not logical that Black Lives Matter should take on every issue for Black folks, it should be focusing on poverty and subsequent crime rates. Why? Because Black Americans have a poverty rate that's 2.5 times higher than that of white Americans, and that entails a higher crime rate that requires a higher presence of police intervention. We do not have a duty to take care of Black lives. We have a duty to take care of all lives, especially if they are overburdened, like poor people. Black Lives Matter exists because they incorrectly attribute racism or apathy to the Black community instead of a general problem of apathy towards impoverished and disadvantaged communities of all ancestries. The mission of Black Lives Matter is supposedly to intervene when violence is inflicted on Black communities by the state or alleged vigilantes, but they do not differentiate between racist-motivated violence and non-racist violence, nor do they separate justified violence from unjustified. They see the deaths of Black men by state actors, including Black actors, or non-Black civilians as racist without looking at the individual facts in each case for merit. The statement Black Lives Matter first arose in 2010, protesting the unjustified killing of Oscar Grant, an African American that was shot in the back while he was on the ground. The officer allegedly mistook his gun for a taser. This is not a solitary case, though, and this type of mistake has affected people outside of the Black community as well. Just for example, Brian Rilling, a white man that was shot by a taser mistake in 2019. At the time, originally, Black Lives Matter meant Black Lives Matter as well, much like the already existing All Lives Matter, not just entitled ones. In 2013, you see that saying take a darker turn to mean Black Lives Matter first, or as they would clarify later, all lives don't matter if Black lives don't matter first. This darker turn arose because of a racial entitlement movement that has been growing that many have coined anti-racism. As John McWhorter, a prominent African-American scholar, has noted, it has taken religious connotations where whites are innately racist and the blacks are perpetual victims. As John McWhorter has pointed out, the movement has evolved not to try to save Black lives as much as use the death of Black lives as political tools for Black Americans to get more social, economic, and political clout. For this, they will ignore that poor white Americans die at the hands of police at similar rates as poor Black Americans, and that poor Native Americans die at a higher rate than both. This is not to say that there are not plenty of valid cases of unarmed civilian unjustified killings, just that these types of killings are not unique to Black Americans. Ahmaud Arbery's shooting by vigilantes is a case in point, but such cases are not unique to Black people. In 2008, an African-American man by the name of Roderick Scott saw a 17-year-old white youth, Christopher Servini, and two 15-year-olds testing cars. He took it upon himself to confront the teens at a neighbor's driveway across the street by pointing his gun at them. The 15-year-olds fled, and while disputed, Scott claimed that the unarmed smaller Servini charged at him. He shot at him multiple times from 20 feet away. The state of New York determined it was a justified homicide. George Floyd is another example. He was suffocated to death by 4 police officers, much like the case of Eric Garner. Both tragic and unjustified homicides. But no different than the cases of Robert Ethan Saylor, Robert Joseph Minhares Jr., Troy Good, Tony Timpa, William Jeanette, etc., all white who died in similar circumstances. Michael Brown was much like Trayvon Martin, an assailant who assaulted the police and was proven in a grand jury that he was charging at the officer when he was shot dead. But in that same week, the police killed a white man, Dylan Taylor, and that case was ignored when he was shot by a policeman with his headphones on, unarmed. Or we can speak of the more recent case of the white man Daniel Shaver, who was unarmed, pleading for his life, made to crawl, and was shot to death. That there's a problem with many officers being trigger-happy does not change the fact that most of these shootings are justified, and the ones that do not span the spectrum of ethno-racial groups who overwhelmingly were in or around impoverished communities. This has been going on for a long while, with valid cases like the homicide by police of Michael Arnold, a white man who was shot over 300 times with over 100 hits and over 50 kill shots in 1998, and Amadou Diallo, an African who was shot in a similarly horrifying way the next year. The point is, as Nick Gillespie in Reasons John McWhorter, America Has Never Been Less Racist, points out, the unwillingness of both blacks and whites to acknowledge progress on racial equality is a long-running theme for McWhorter, who in 2000 published Losing the Race, Self-Sabotage in Black America, which argued that in most cases racism is not an obstacle to people being the best they can be. In his new book, Anti-Racism, Our Flawed New Religion, McWhorter argued that anti-racism has become a new secular religion in America, complete with clergy, creed, and also even a conception of original sin. Today's monster of economic inequality and disenfranchisement are the biggest obstacle to help stop the rates of high mortality due to police homicides. Until we address the root causes of that disproportionate criminal element rooted in poverty, disenfranchisement, lack of employment, and somehow correct those root causes, high crime rates will continue to drive high police interaction. And no matter how much police departments are accused and persecuted on charges of racism, numbers of arrests will continue to be higher because the number of victims will demand it. And meanwhile, Black Lives Matter has made the death toll worse, not better.
We, the jury, find George Zimmerman not guilty.
And the 6 women of the jury say George Zimmerman was acting in self-defense when he shot
it was a
Trayvon.
fair trial.
Of 6 white women was going to be favorable.
Since when is an Afro-Puerto Rican a white woman?
At that point, not only was I frustrated, as many people were, but despite holding the highest office of the land, the question was, all right, what can I do with this?
Something that we call My Brother's Keeper, an initiative to ensure that all young people, but with a particular focus on young men of color, have a chance to go as far as their dreams will take them.
Ironically, George Zimmerman was already being his brother's keeper for 2 young African-American kids that had parents that were serving a life sentence, and he was doing the right thing before being persecuted unjustly.
My hope is that we look back on what happened with Trayvon and are able to say that that was the start of America looking inward, and in fits and starts, coming to terms with what has always been our original sin.
The original sin was not the enslavement of Africans. It was the conquest and enslavement of Native Americans. And George Zimmerman was both the descendant of Native Americans and Africans. And yet, you threw him under the bus. This is the grandmother of George Zimmerman, who died in hiding because of the death threats that George Zimmerman's Afro-Peruvian family received during this whole time for the unjustified scapegoating that you committed against that family. You committed the original sin against a family that had both Native American and African ancestry.